Let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to pull back the curtain on a side of Pompeii you probably haven't heard about. Look, we all know the story, right? Mount Vesuvius erupts, the city is frozen in time in this ultimate ancient tragedy. But what if I told you that the story we all know and obsess over is really just the final act of a much, much larger saga? Seriously, long before a single flake of volcanic ash ever fell from the sky, a brutal, forgotten battle completely reshaped this city. We're going to explore a violent siege that actually altered the course of the Roman Empire. It goes to show that Pompeii's most dramatic days were actually driven by human conflict, not geological doom.
So think about it for a second. What is Pompeii actually most famous for? For basically the entire world, it's 100% associated with that one catastrophic natural disaster. The whole 80-70 narrative just completely dominates how we understand the site today. It's kind of like the city didn't even exist until the mountain blew its top. But if you peel back a century of dirt, you'll find that Pompeii definitely wasn't just sitting around waiting for doomsday. Actually, it was this vibrant, politically charged, and violently rebellious stronghold. Its history had absolutely nothing to do with volcanoes and literally everything to do with political defiance.
That 8079 eruption is globally famous, obviously, but its massive shadow completely obscures a total bloodbath that happened in 89 BC. We're not talking about a quiet, peaceful provincial town that just got unlucky with nature. No, this was a fierce geopolitical battleground. To really get Pompeii, we have to travel back to a time when the absolute biggest threat to its existence wasn't that towering mountain looming in the background. It was the towering ambition of the Roman military machine, and they were marching directly toward the city gates.
So, what sparked all this? Well, this violently turbulent era kicked off with a massive rebellion we now call the Social War. And just to be clear, this wasn't some defensive campaign against foreign invaders sailing across the Mediterranean. This was a bitter, bloody civil war right there on the Italian peninsula. Rome's closest allies, the Socii, which, by the way, is exactly where we get the term social war, were completely fed up. I mean, for generations, they had provided troops and paid taxes to build up the Roman Republic, but they were totally denied the right to vote, run for office, or hold equal citizenship. They were treated like second-class citizens, and eventually they decided enough was enough. They were going to take what they were owed by force. Right around 89 BC, these Italian allies, including the fierce, independent Oscan-speaking folks living in Pompeii, along with their neighbors, the Samnites, they all banded together. And here's the wild part. Pompeii didn't just watch from the sidelines, crossing their fingers for a favorable outcome. Not at all. They were a heavily armed rebel stronghold. They aggressively took up arms, they fortified their city, and they demanded equality from a Roman Republic that was getting increasingly oppressive. This was a desperate, all-or-nothing fight for civil rights, and it was backed by thousands of drawn swords. It's incredibly easy for us to just compress ancient history in our heads. We kind of blend all these events together into one vague timeline. But think about this for a second. There is a staggering 170-year gap between this political uprising and the volcanic eruption. A full century and a half before the volcano blew, Pompeii lived his entirely different life of defiance and warfare. Entire generations of Pompeians were born, lived, fought, and died in a completely different paradigm long before nature ever intervened. The people defending those walls had absolutely no idea that their descendants were going to face an entirely different kind of apocalypse. Now, as you might guess, Rome didn't exactly take this armed rebellion lightly. The Republic was absolutely terrified of losing its grip on Italy. So what do? They dispatched General Lucius Cornelius Sulla. If you know your Roman history, you know Sulla was a guy who would later become an infamous, utterly ruthless dictator. He was renowned for a terrible temper and totally merciless tactics. Well, he marched his seasoned, battle-hardened legions directly to Pompeii. He had one single, brutal mission: lay siege to the city, break down those walls, and basically crush their defiance into dust to send a stark warning to the rest of the rebellious peninsula. Sulla's assault was just a masterclass in relentless Roman military tactics. He didn't just casually surround the city and try to starve them out, no. He immediately went right for Pompeii's massive, imposing stone walls. And when those traditional infantry charges couldn't quite break through the defenses, Rome cranked up the violence. They dragged in heavy, state-of-the-art siege weapons right up to the front lines. They were determined to batter the city into submission using sheer, overwhelming mechanical force. Honestly, the scale of this assault was unlike anything the region had ever seen before. Just try to imagine the sheer, mechanical, man-made terror raining down on the city. We are talking about the deafening, rhythmic crack of heavy, iron-tipped battering rams smashing against the gates. We're talking about the terrifying trajectory of catapults, which were basically the artillery of the ancient world, hurling massive stone payloads directly at the defensive walls and straight into the city streets. It's such a jarring, violent contrast to the silent drift of ash that would gently, yet lethally, blanket the cities centuries later. This destruction was loud, it was deliberate, and it was driven entirely by human rage. Now, you might reasonably think that a volcanic eruption burying a city under 20 feet of pumice and ash would just completely erase all evidence of a localized battle from a century prior, right? But it didn't. If you go walk up to the Herculaneum Gate in Pompeii today, archaeologists have actually uncovered the physical, jagged pockmarks of Roman catapult strikes directly on the masonry. It's incredible. You are literally looking at permanent battle scars from Sulla's siege, preserved perfectly right there in the middle of the volcanic ruins, just hiding in plain sight. So how did it end? Well, despite the fierce bravery of the defenders and their desperate resistance against the Roman war machine, Rome's technological superiority and endless manpower eventually won out. Pompeii was forced to formally surrender. But here's the real twist. As punishment for their rebellion, Sulla settled thousands of his hardened veteran soldiers directly inside the city. He basically forced the rebellious locals to integrate with their conquerors. He confiscated their property and actively went about erasing their native Oscan language, forcing the entire city to adopt Latin from that day forward. And all of this leads us to what has to be history's ultimate irony. The outcome of this siege, especially when you compare it to the city's ultimate famous fate, creates a historical paradox that is almost too poetic to be true. It really reads like a Greek tragedy, and it perfectly showcases just how unpredictable human history can be when it finally collides with the natural world. Seriously, think about this incredible paradox for a second. The citizens of Pompeii fought this brutal, bloody war, literally shedding their own blood to avoid being swallowed up by Rome's political and military machine. Yet nearly 170 years later, their descendants were quite literally swallowed by the earth during the AD 79 eruption. The land they fought so desperately to control was just abruptly taken from everyone. And the ultimate irony? The very natural disaster that completely annihilated the city is exactly what preserved their streets, their art, and even those ancient battle scars for 2 millennia. The ultimate destroyer turned out to be the ultimate preserver. I think this reveals something truly fascinating about how human memory works over thousands of years. The cinematic, apocalyptic fame of Mount Vesuvius has entirely overshadowed Pompeii's critical role in the social war. Their bold fight for Italian unity, for representation, and for equal civil rights has been practically erased from popular culture. All of that profound political struggle and human ambition was buried, and I mean not just literally buried under the ash of a much more famous disaster, but metaphorically buried in our historical consciousness. As history shows us time and time again, we have this habit of remembering the flashy, apocalyptic disaster. But sometimes, the forgotten battle tells an equally fascinating, if not way more complex story. Looking past the volcanic ash of Pompeii reveals this incredibly rich timeline of human resilience, brutal geopolitical conflict, and some of the earliest fights for civil rights in the ancient world. It's a great reminder that the places we think we know inside and out often have much deeper, richer stories just waiting to be told. So let's wrap this explainer up with a thought to take with you. If Pompeii, literally one of the most intensely studied and excavated sites on the entire planet, was hiding a massive geopolitical war right beneath our noses, what other incredible hidden histories are buried under the very earth we walk on today? What other famous historical sites are holding on to forgotten chapters of human struggle, completely overshadowed by their own larger-than-life legends? It's something to think about. Keep that curiosity alive, and thanks for joining me.